African Religions and Philosophy. This is the title of a 1969 book by Kenyan philosopher and theologian John Mbiti. And I'm also reading this handbook of African philosophy. Hi, my name is Mumbi, and in this essay, I want to talk about African philosophy. I'll start first with the philosophy part, and then later, towards the end of the video, I'll talk about the African part. So I've never really ever studied philosophy. So I always used to think philosophy was a static body of knowledge. But come to find out, philosophy is actually also an activity. From how I understand it, philosophy is more of a verb than it is a noun. Because to engage with philosophy means to think philosophically or to philosophize. And to think philosophically means to make philosophical inquiry. And I know you're going to ask me, okay, Mumbi, what is a philosophical inquiry? And I'm going to read, I'll quote here from Elvis Imafidon, who writes that philosophical inquiries are by their very nature attempts to understand and interpret the very essence of our experiences and to search for reliable, meaningful, yet debatable and questionable answers to such fundamental questions as what is real, what it means to be, what is truth, what is knowledge, what is permissible action, what is beautiful, and what is just. So that's philosophy, means to philosophize. So a philosopher is somebody who philosophizes or who makes philosophical inquiry. And so African philosophy means to philosophize from an African place, but we get to that in a bit. Since I'm interested here in African philosophy, I think I should also talk a bit about language. Because philosophy as a word, its etymology, it is derived from Greek words. So for a long time, colonialism said that philosophy is a Western experience. But post-colonial critique tells us that actually philosophy is just a human activity, and traditions of philosophy have existed the world over. And so I'll quote from a paper by Upokolo, where he talks about this naming of the term philosophy, um, and philosophy just being a human experience. And he says that there is ample evidence from all human traditions that philosophizing and concerns with philosophical issues have existed in all human traditions, taking different forms, stored in different repositories of knowledge, and approached using different methods within and across traditions. So, philosophy or philosophizing as an activity has existed in all human traditions. So, it's not just a Western or a Greek experience by virtue of naming. But if we know this, that this genre of thought has also existed among different African peoples, why then continue using the term philosophy to describe African traditions of thought? Why not use, for example, indigenous terms or the African terms of what this genre of thought already exists as in different among different African peoples? And so actually Upokolo asks it in this way. He says, but does the continuous use of Western categories in presenting and representing African forms of philosophizing not further perpetuate the claim that African philosophy is only a mimicking of Western philosophy, which would imply that philosophy remains a Greek experience rather than a human experience? It is a fair question and one that divides African scholars. And in order to try and like understand this question better and to try and answer it, I'm going to use the famous debate between Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Chinua Achebe, not on philosophy, but on language in African literature, to try and help us understand the use of the term philosophy. Because the way we use philosophy and its related terms, epistemology, ontology, and so on, in an African setting, it's that we're taking these Western categories and trying to study African traditions of thought using these Western words or these Western frameworks. So why do we continue to do that? But let's talk about the debate between Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Chinua Achebe. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o was of the opinion that it didn't make sense for African writers to continue writing in colonial languages because to him, to continue writing in English, for example, was to continue the colonial project of erasure. So radically, I believe in the late 70s, Ngugi wa Thiong'o stopped writing in English and went back to writing in his mother tongue Gikuyu and in Kiswahili, because he believed that African writers should tell their own stories in their own languages. On the other hand, Chinua Achebe was of the opinion that yes, language was a tool of colonial subjugation. However, if the colonizer could use language as a tool, then so can we, because to him, language isn't a prison. For him, it was possible to Africanize colonial languages so that they can carry the weight of African experiences. So let's try and apply this to philosophy. From the Achebe perspective, you can say then, yes, it is possible to use the term philosophy to describe African traditions of thought. If you take philosophy and put in Yoruba proverbs or Zulu proverbs, and if enough of us do it, it changes what philosophy means globally. But I think, I don't know, but I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o would vehemently disagree, as he does in Decolonizing the Mind, because I think he would say that African languages should come up with their own frameworks, or that we should reclaim and use the indigenous words for what this genre of thought already exists as in different African communities and languages. Um, of course, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's position is radical, and to know me is to know that I'm where the radicals are. But of course, one could say that Ngugi's perspective is very isolating, and that if we want to have conversations, not just with the world, but even with each other, then it makes sense to use the umbrella term of philosophy. Um, but I think Ngugi would also disagree to this, because from reading Decolonizing the Mind, one thing I know is that he hated this argument that colonial languages serve as a bridge for Africans to communicate with each other. So we need Western words and Western languages to have umbrella terms to so that we can communicate with each other, because he said African languages can do the same thing. They can also function in the same way. So for him, it wasn't a good enough argument to continue using colonial languages and colonial terms. Um, so yeah, I think if you're asking me whose side am I on on this debate, I think it would depend on what I'm trying to do. If, say, for example, I was interested in exploring like Kikuyu worldviews, then of course I wouldn't need the term philosophy, and Ngugi's perspective would win, because I would just try to look for what is the Kikuyu word or the expressions, or how did this genre of thought exist as in Kikuyu. Whereas if I'm interested as a post-colonial Pan-African scholar, studying African studies, then maybe I would need the term African philosophy, because, and this brings me to the next part I want to talk about, of what the African part means in African philosophy. Because remember in the previous essay, I talked about Mudimbe's The Invention of Africa. And we said Africa as we know it, as an essentialized, generic, homogenized concept, was a colonial invention for the purpose of othering Africa to be measured against Europe for the colonial project. However, as post colonial Pan Africanists, we still do need Africa as an identity and as a concept, not the colonial essentialized one, but an Africa of post colonial solidarity. Of course, taking into account the colonial experience wasn't uniform um, everywhere on the continent. So if you're thinking of Africa in that way, in a post-colonial Africa of solidarity, then it makes sense to use the term philosophy, because we are active in the redefinition of not only what African means, but also what philosophy means for us today. And this brings me to the next part of what the African part means. So we've already gone over what we talked about Mudimbe in the previous essay. But so in the beginning of this video, I said that African philosophy is to philosophize from an African place. So then you would ask me, okay, Mumbi, what or where is an African place? And there's a paper by Upokolo where he says that there are two ways that we use the term African. The first is as a point of view. And Bruce Yans says that we all come from a place, and that place affects how we understand the world. And that place isn't just a geographic place, but it is also a set of commitments, what we care about, and what we are rooted in. And I read from John Mbiti's African Religions and Philosophy, where he said that African philosophy here refers to the understanding, attitude of mind, logic, and perception behind the manner in which African peoples think, act, or speak in different situations of life. But the real interesting part for me is that he says that what therefore is African philosophy may not amount to more than simply my own process of philosophizing the items under consideration, but this cannot be helped, and in any case, I am by birth an African. And because remember, if philosophy is a philosopher's own philosophization, it cannot be divorced from subjectivity, because a philosopher must come from a place. And that African place, that African as a point of view, is, I think, what Mbiti shows perfectly in that last quote that I've just read. According to Pokolo, the second way that we use the term African is for solidarity. And this is just what I was explaining before. That today, as post colonial scholars or post colonial Pan Africanists, we are interested in the redefinition of and the uninvention of Africa from a colonial lens. And we are interested in redefining what Africa means for us today, a post-colonial legacy, a post-colonial African legacy of solidarity. Speaking of Africa in the plural, not in the singular homogenized colonial invention. So that is another way that we use the term African. And those are two ways that you can understand the African when we talk about African philosophy. Yeah, so I think those are the main points that I wanted to talk about in this essay. African philosophy means to philosophize from an African place. And we've seen philosophy is an activity of thinking philosophically, which means to make philosophical inquiry. Um, and then we've seen that philosophy is a human experience. It's a tradition of thought that has existed the world over, including all across Africa. So why still continue to use the term philosophy? Because we have seen that it is possible to Africanize the term um, so that it is capable of defining African traditions of thought. Of course, speaking of Africa in the plural, because we know that Africa is not an essentialized, homogenized invention that Mudimbe exposed it to be from a colonial lens. Yes, so that is African philosophy, philosophizing from an African place. Thank you for listening to this essay, and stick around, and maybe in the next essays we're going to get into other specific aspects of philosophy, of African philosophy. It could be African communitarianism, what we know as Ubuntu, gender, the concept of time, and so much more. So asante kwa kusikiliza, and you'll hear me again in the next one. Kwaheri.